Arietti had not been asleep. She had been lying under her knitted coverlet, staring up at the ceiling. It was an interesting ceiling. Pod had built Arietti's bedroom out of 2 cigar boxes, and on the ceiling, lovely painted ladies dressed in swirls of chiffon blew long trumpets against a black background of blue sky. Below there were feathery palm trees and small white houses set about a square. It was a glamorous scene, above all by candlelight, but tonight Arietti had stared without seeing. The wood of a cigar box is thin, and Arietti, lying straight and still under the quilt, had heard the rise and fall of worried voices. She had heard her own name. She had heard Homily exclaim, "Nuts and berries, that's what they eat!" And she had heard, after a while, the heartfelt cry of, "What shall we do?" So when Homily appeared beside her bed, she wrapped herself obediently in her quilt, and padding in her bare feet along the dusty passage, she joined her parents in the warmth of the kitchen. Crouched on her little stool, she sat clasping her knees, shivering a little, and looking from one face to another. Homily came beside her, and kneeling on the floor, she placed an arm around Arietti's skinny shoulders. "Arietti," she said gravely, "you know about upstairs?" "What about it?" asked Arietti. "You know there are 2 giants?" "Yes," said Arietti. "Great Aunt Sophie and Mrs. Driver." "That's right," said Homily. "And Crampfurl in the garden." She laid a roughened hand on Arietti's clasped ones. "You know about Uncle Hendreary?" Arietti thought a while. "He went abroad," she said. "Emigrated," corrected Homily, "to the other side of the world, with Aunt Loopy and all the children, to a badger's set, a hole in a bank under a hawthorn hedge. Now why do you think he did this?" "Oh," said Arietti, her face alight. "To be out of doors, to lie in the sun, to run in the grass, to swing on twigs like the birds do, to suck honey?" "Nonsense, Arietti," exclaimed Homily sharply. "That's a nasty habit, and your Uncle Hendreary's a rheumatic sort of man. He emigrated," she went on, stressing the word, "because he was seen." "Oh," said Arietti. "He was seen on the 23rd of April, 1892, by Rosa Pickhatchett, on the drawing-room mantelpiece. Of all the places," she added suddenly, in a wondering aside. "I have never heard, nor no one has ever seen fit to tell why he went on the drawing-room mantelpiece in the first place. There's nothing on it, your father assures me, which cannot be seen from the floor or by standing sideways on the handle of the bureau and steadying yourself on the key. That's what your father does if he ever goes into the drawing-room." "They said it was a liver pill," put in Pod. "How do you mean?" asked Homily, startled. "A liver pill for Loopy." Pod spoke warily. "Someone started a rumour," he went on, "that there were liver pills on the drawing-room mantelpiece." "Oh," said Homily, and looked thoughtful. "I never heard that." "All the same," she exclaimed, "it was stupid and foolhardy. There's no way down except by the bell pull. She dusted him, they say, with a feather duster, and he stood so still alongside a cupid that she might never have noticed him if he hadn't sneezed. She was new, you see, and didn't know the ornaments. We heard her screeching right here under the kitchen. And they could never get her to clean anything much after that wasn't chairs or tables, least of all the tiger-skin rug." "I don't hardly never bother with the drawing-room," said Pod. "Everything's got its place like, and they see what goes. There might be a little something left on a table or down the side of a chair, but not without there's been company, and there never is no company, not for the last 10 or 12 year. Sitting here in this chair, I can tell you by heart every blessed thing that's in that drawing-room, working round from the cabinet by the window to the—" "There's a mint of things in that cabinet," interrupted Homily. "Solid silver, some of them. A solid silver violin they got there, strings and all, just right for our Arietti." "What's the good," asked Pod, "of things being behind glass?" "Couldn't you break it?" suggested Arietti. "Just a corner, just a little tap, just a—" Her voice faltered as she saw the shocked amazement on her father's face. "Listen here, Arietti," began Homily angrily, and then she controlled herself and patted Arietti's clasped hands. "She don't know much about borrowing," she explained to Pod. "You can't blame her." She turned again to Arietti. "Borrowing's a skill job, an art-like. Of all the families who've been in this house, there's only us left. And do you know why? Because your father, Arietti, is the best borrower that's been known in these parts since, well, before your granddad's time. Even your Aunt Loopy admitted that much. When he was younger, I've seen your father walk the length of a laid dinner table, after the gong was rung, taking a nut or sweet from every dish and down by a fold in the tablecloth as the first people came in the door. He'd do it just for fun, wouldn't you, Pod? Pod smiled wanly. There weren't no sense in it, he said. Maybe, said Homily, but you did it. Who else would dare? I were younger then, said Pod. He sighed and turned to Arrietty. You don't break things, lass. That's not the way to do it. That's not borrowing. We were rich then, said Homily. Oh, we did have some lovely things. You were only a tot, Arrietty, and wouldn't remember. We had a whole suit of walnut furniture out of the doll's house and a set of wine glasses in green glass and a musical snuff box, and the cousins would come and we'd have parties. Do you remember, Pod? Not only the cousins. The harpsichords came. Everybody came, except those overmantels from the morning room. And we'd dance, and the young people would sit out by the grating. 3 tunes that snuff box played. Clementine, God Save the Queen, and Post-Chaise Gallop. We were the envy of everybody, even the overmantels. Who were the overmantels? Asked Arrietty. Oh, you must have heard me talk of the overmantels, exclaimed Homily. That stuck-up lot who lived in the wall high up among the lath and plaster behind the mantelpiece in the morning room, and a queer lot they were. The men smoked all the time because the tobacco jars were kept there, and they'd climb about and in and out of the carvings of the overmantel, sliding down pillars and showing off. The women were a conceited lot too, always admiring themselves in all those bits of overmantel-looking glass. They never asked anyone up there, and I, for one, never wanted to go. I've no head for heights, and your father never liked the men. He always lived steady, your father has. And not only the tobacco jars, but the whisky decanters too, were kept in the morning room, and they say those overmantel men would suck up the dregs in the glasses through those quill pipe cleaners they keep there on the mantelpiece. I don't know whether it's true, but they do say that those overmantel men used to have a party every Tuesday after the bailiff had been to talk business in the morning room. Laid out, they'd be dead drunk, or so the story goes, on the green plush tablecloth, all among the tin boxes and the account books. Now, Homily, protested Pod, who did not like the gossip. I'd never seed 'em. But you wouldn't put it past them, Pod. You said yourself when I married you not to call on the overmantels. They lived so high, said Pod. That's all. Well, they were a lazy lot. That much you can't deny. They never had no kind of home life. Kept themselves warm in winter by the heat of the morning room fire and ate nothing but breakfast food. Breakfast, of course, was the only meal served in the morning room. What happened to them? Asked Arrietty. Well, when the master died and she took to her bed, there were no more use for the morning room, so the overmantels had to go. What else could they do? No food, no fire. It's a bitter cold in winter. And the harpsichords? Asked Arrietty. Homily looked thoughtful. Well, they were different. I'm not saying they weren't stuck up too, because they were. Your Aunt Loopy, who married your Uncle Hendreary, was a harpsichord by marriage, and we all know the airs she gave herself. Now, Homily, began Pod. Well, she'd no right to. She was only a rainpipe from the stables before she married harpsichord. Didn't she marry Uncle Hendreary? Asked Arrietty. Yes, later. She was a widow with 2 children, and he was a widower with 3. It's no good looking at me like that, Pod. You can't deny she took it out of poor Hendreary. She thought it was a come down to marry a clock. Why? Asked Arrietty. Because we clocks live under the kitchen, that's why. Because we don't talk fancy grammar and eat anchovy toast. But to live under the kitchen doesn't say we aren't educated. The clocks are just as old a family as the harpsichords. You remember that, Arrietty, and don't let anyone tell you different. Your grandfather could count and write down the numbers up to, what was it, Pod? 57, said Pod. There, said Homily, 57, and your father can count, as you know, Arrietty. He can count and write down the numbers on and on as far as it goes. How far does it go, Pod? Close on 1,000, said Pod. There, exclaimed Homily, and he knows the alphabet because he taught you, Arrietty, didn't he? Andy would have been able to read, wouldn't you, Pod, if he hadn't had to start borrowing so young. Your Uncle Hendreary and your father had to go out borrowing at 13, Your age, Arietti. Think of it. But I should like, began Arietti. So we didn't have your advantages, went on Homily breathlessly, and just because the harpsichords lived in the drawing room, they moved in there in 1837 to a hole in the wainscot just behind where the harpsichord used to stand, if ever there was one, which I doubt, and were a real family called Linen Press, or some such name, and changed it to harpsichord. What did they live on? Asked Arietti, in the drawing room. Afternoon tea, said Homily. Nothing but afternoon tea. No wonder the children grew up peaky. Of course, in the old days it was better. Muffins and crumpets and such, and good rich cake and jams and jellies, and there was one old harpsichord who could remember syllabub of an evening. But they had to do their borrowing in such a rush, poor things. On wet days, when the human beings sat all afternoon in the drawing room, the tea would be brought in and taken away without a chance of the harpsichords getting near it, and on fine days it would be taken out into the garden. Loopy has told me that sometimes there were days and days where they lived on crumbs and on water out of the flower vases, so you can't be too hard on them. Their only comfort, poor things, was to show off a bit and wear evening dress and talk like ladies and gentlemen. Did you ever hear your Aunt Loopy talk? Yes. No, I can't remember. Oh, you should have heard her say parquet. That's the stuff the drawing room floor's made out of. Parquet. Parquet, she'd say. Oh, it was lovely. Come to think of it, your Aunt Loopy was the most stuck up of them all. Arietti shivering, said Pod. We didn't get the little maid up to talk about Aunt Loopy. Nor we did, cried Homily, suddenly contrite. You should have stopped me, Pod. There, my lamb, tuck this quilt right round you, and I'll get you a nice drop of piping hot soup. And yet, said Pod, as Homily, fussing at the stove, ladled soup into the teacup, we did in a way. Did what? Asked Homily. Get her here to talk about Aunt Loopy. Aunt Loopy, Uncle Hendreary, and... He paused. Eglantine. Let her drink up her soup first, said Homily. There's no call for her to stop drinking, said Pod.